In my previous video, I mentioned that certain DAWs, in my opinion, are not very suitable for professional mastering, and a lot of people push back in the comments saying, why not? They do mastering on their tracks all the time in XYZ DAW, and it's fine. And with mastering, it's more to do with what you're doing in your plugins than any special functionality or features in a DAW. That's what people said in the comments. Now, I wanted to make this update video to give my side of the perspective of why I actually know you can't do mastering at professional level in some of these DAWs. Now, of course, you're fully entitled to bounce your track out as a stereo mix, then put it back in the DAW, run it through Isotype Ozone or something like that, and then call that the master. You can do that if you want, but in my opinion, that's not what professional mastering is, and if that's what you think mastering is, then we're talking past each other. It's sort of like saying that you're a pilot because you've played Flight Simulator. I think many commercial pilots are going to disagree with that. Now, as a mastering engineer, yes, I do EQ stuff and put limiters and compressors on stuff. That is part of my job, but that's not the entirety of my job. And a large part of what is going to determine my income as a mastering engineer is how efficient I can work and my workflow, my process in how I actually work. I'm definitely not interested in rushing my work. I want to get a good result, and I want to spend the right amount of time in getting that best result that I can get. However, all of the repetitive and trivial tasks involving session prep and rendering and all of these other things, I want to minimize as much as possible so I can focus 100% or as close to as possible on the actual mastering work, the actual skilled part of the job, and not faffing about with all of this peripheral stuff that just wastes time. So if my DAW lacks certain productivity features or I've just got friction when using it, then that's going to slow me down. I'm going to be able to earn less money with it, and so that's a massive disqualification factor right there. So what are some of these essential productivity features that I'm talking about? Well, first up, we've got fast loading times. Now, you can load stuff in every DAW. You can chuck audio in and you can arrange it how you want on the screen, and you can do whatever you want. But I'm not talking about just manually sitting there and setting up everything in my session manually. What I do is, when I get a session, I chuck it into my DAW Reaper, I press one shortcut and everything is set up. I've got all my plugin chains loaded, I've got all of the regions set up with gaps in between, sequentially loaded on sequential tracks, all of the markers are named, I've got 100 milliseconds at the start. Everything is set up exactly so that I can start work within 2 seconds of unzipping the audio file. Next up, features for stem mastering. Now, I do a lot of stem mastering, so if we're lacking these features in my DAW, I just can't work. So for example, non-destructive summing of stems. If I get a folder of stems, whether that's 40 or 100 stems, I just want to chuck that in, sum that all down to one stereo track, and I want to work on the stereo. I don't want to work on each individual stem and see it cluttering up my screen and being confused by 100 different stems. I don't care about that. Generally speaking, I wouldn't like to receive 100 stems, but sometimes I do receive 100 stems, and then it's not even the stems, it's just the multi-track. But in that case, I just want to sum it all down to one thing, the stereo, and I want to see the stereo. And then when I hear something, that sounds a bit off, I need to go into those stems and change something, then I can go and do that, make that adjustment, and then come right back out again and see the stereo. And I'm always working in the stereo view as a mastering engineer. I'm not a mix engineer predominantly, I'm a mastering engineer predominantly. So I want to see the stereo. And so most DAWs don't have that feature that you can just do non-destructive stereo summing so that you can actually see the stereo signal there. I don't want to see just like some blank folder track or something. I want to actually see the sum of all the tracks and work with that as if that was a final rendered stereo mix. And I don't want to have to bounce that out and then import it back in and do a whole bunch of nonsense. But not only am I going to be doing stem mastering for single tracks, I'm going to be doing stem mastering in albums. And you might have mixtures of stereo tracks and then stem tracks, and you've got to mix all of that in and chuck that all into your session and set that up in a way which is logical, and you can work without being confused or overwhelmed by the number of tracks. Super important. But adding to the complexity, not only do I need to do all that for potentially an album, but now let's increase the complexity and make that a gapless album. Can your DAW now do that layer of complexity, gapless stem mastering album with 300 tracks, for example. Can your DAW handle that? But it doesn't stop there, because the complexity increases when you're working with stem albums that have multiple versions. And this is actually quite common, that the lead track, the lead single of the album would have maybe a radio edit or an extended version or something like this. It's the same sort of processing that you're doing, but we've got different lengths. There's edited versions. So now we have multiple versions of tracks on a stem gapless album. But then it gets more complex because we have the different revisions of those things. So you might have 3 revisions of some tracks, 2 revisions of other tracks, 4 revisions of this track that they were particularly fussy about, and then you've got the multiple versions. So you've got to be able to keep track of all of this: stem, mastering, gapless, album with multiple versions and multiple revisions. But now, because we need to keep track of that, we also are going to need some notes. We're going to need good quality note storing capabilities within our session. So we need global notes for our entire session, and we also need per track basis notes. The client might say, okay, well, we've done 3-4 revisions of this track, but I've actually changed my mind and I want to go back to revision 2. And if you're still following me, if that wasn't complex enough, then you've also got automation thrown into the mix. So when you're doing stem mastering, of course you need to do automation. They might say, we want the chorus to hit more, so we've got to automate certain things up or automate other things down in the verses to give more dynamics, etc., etc. But there might be different versions of that, and that might be the basis for a revision, and that's often the basis for a revision. So your different revisions have different automations, and they are different versions with different edits across different tracks of the album, and it's all starting to get very complex, and you need to take notes and you need to know exactly what is happening in your session, and you can't lose track, because if you start sending the wrong versions, or the customer comes back and says, okay, I'll take M1 of that but M3 of that and M2 of that, and then for the vinyl versions you mix all of that up, well, now they're gonna send it off to get cut from the wrong versions. They're gonna get the test press back and listen to it and discover, oh no, that's not correct, that's wrong. So now you're going to have to pay for a new lacquer to be cut, for a new test press to be pressed. So you're going to pay all of that out of your own pocket, and that's hundreds of euros, hundreds of dollars to do that. In some cases, if they've just gone straight to vinyl, they might ruin their entire initial press of vinyl, and you have to pay for all of it again out of your pocket because you were the one who messed up. And all of these things you need to be extremely precise with. So can you just do all of that in Reason? Can you do all of that in Fruity Loops? Can you do all of that in Ableton? I'm not so sure you can do that in Ableton or in Reason or Fruity Loops. Let me know down below if you think you can, and I'd be interested to see some sort of response video from you guys who think that you can do all of this in some of these other DAWs. Like, I know that you can do all of this in Cubase, and I said that in my previous video. You can do all of that in Cubase and some of these other DAWs, but can you do that in Reason, for example? So let's say that your DAW can do all of those things. We've loaded in our client's work, we've been working on it, and everything's great, and we're ready to send the first version of the album. So now we've got, let's say, 16, 17 files to bounce out and send to the client with the different versions, and maybe some tracks you've done a red version and a blue version, which I like to do depending on the processing that you did for a specific track. And now, so you've got, let's say, 17 things that you've got to bounce to your client. Are you going to sit there and manually get the time selection, listen to the start of the track and get the start point, and then listen to the fade out and get the end point, and then bounce that and type in the file name and wait for it to bounce, and then go to the second track and do the same with the time selection manually, and then bounce that out and type in the file name and then wait for it to bounce, and then go to the third track and do that for all 17 tracks? So it's going to take ages. And then you send that to your client and they get back and say, oh yeah, it's great, but can you make it half a dB louder? Now you've got to make it half a dB louder and do that process all again and get the time selection. And you've already listened to where the start of the track is, and you've already listened to where the reverb tail fades out and you want to end the track. You've already done all of that, but now you have to do it again because your DAW doesn't have any statically set up time markers to do that. Now, mastering software has had this feature integrated since literally the 90s. I used to use Wavelab, for example, for my stereo mastering way back in the day before I switched 100% to Reaper, and you could do all of that stuff because it was set up for the CD markers. So you had all of those mastering features with the automatic file naming and all of that stuff. You had it from day one pretty much in the professional mastering software like Wavelab and all of the rest. They can all do that. But when you come to something which is supposed to be for making beats, it doesn't have those features because you don't need those features for making beats. Why would you need that? You've got one song. Normally, the way that DAW is set up is you're making a song. You're not mastering an album in a DAW. Normally, it's more orientated for mastering stuff. So the mastering stuff was all of those features, and stuff like Ableton and Bitwig don't have those features. Ironically, some of these dedicated mastering DAWs can't do all of this stuff with stems, and so they can't even keep up with the demands of the modern mastering engineer, and they're just riding on their previous prestige as being high-end dedicated mastering software. But in this day and age, it's just overpriced legacy nonsense, and you can just completely upgrade your workflow by switching to something like Reaper. That's why I'm so happy with Reaper and why I rate it S tier. Now, as I say, Cubase can do all this stuff. I was probably a bit harsh on Cubase in my previous video. It could probably definitely be an A tier at least as well, Cubase. But yeah, a lot of these things like Bitwig and Ableton, you just can't do this stuff in those DAWs. And you might say, okay, yeah, but they're for making electronic music. But Reaper's for making music as well. It doesn't say, Reaper doesn't advertise itself as a specific mastering DAW. It's an all-round DAW, right? So all of these other ones are all-round DAWs as well. So if they're decent, then they should be able to do all of these things with all these features, but they can't. So that's why, in my opinion, you cannot use some of these DAWs for doing professional mastering work. So if you use something other than Reaper or Cubase and you think that your DAW can handle all of these tasks perfectly, then let me know down below what you're using, because I'm very interested in checking that out. And if you didn't see the original video which sparked all of the controversy in the comments, then check it out here.